Welcome to the SPA's People Committee. First of all, apologies. We had some IT issues and needed to make sure that we were quorate, which is why we delayed, and I very much appreciate people's forbearance in taking further time out of their very busy lives. But I still would expect that the committee will finish at the appropriate time. If I do drop off the call, I'm going to ask Paul to step in and chair the meeting until I get reconnected. As always, warm welcome to HMICS, staff associations and trade unions who always add a richness to our meeting. And just to remind people who are here for the first time in terms of the role of the board members is to question and challenge sportively the papers that we're presented with. We then, in terms of our staff association and trade unions, can give us comments to add to the flavour of the paper, and if there's any further questions to be asked, members can pick that up and ask questions based on some of the reflections that we've had from our staff side and trade union colleagues. We've received apologies from Alistair Hay and Tom Halpin in advance of today's meeting. I've not had any declarations of interest notified in advance, so I'm noting that. First of all, I'm going to invite members to agree the draft public minute from the meeting held on the 6th of February as accurate. So if we approve that, thank you very much. I'm actually going to take, no, I'll take the decision of taking items. I'll just take it as we go. The rolling action log and matters arising. I wonder if we can just go through that, because there's some that I'm seeing proposed to close that I'm wondering if we would be better to wait till the end of the meeting until we make that decision. So the first, sorry, wait a minute, here we are. Our first, the workforce reports, we're proposing ongoing with that, so I'm content that further work needs to be done to look at the holistic picture, so I'm content to have that as ongoing. People update, I see Vicky's here with us, so we'll get an update in our August meeting. Health and safety, requested information to reflect in the format making up the report continue to be fine-tuned in line with members' feedback. Proposed to close. Are people content with us, Michelle and Paul, that we close that and continue to finesse that on ongoing papers? The ACC, sorry, I'm having to move my screen around so I can see. Training, to be provided, steps taken to mitigate against issues around training from EDI perspective. Can you remind me about the, Stuart, I see you're here. Can you remind us on the briefing paper that we received?
Good morning. I think Alan Gibson is going to cover that one.
Okay. Is Alan on the call with us, or?
Yes, Alan's here, yeah.
Yeah, morning, Chair, if it's okay.
Morning, yes, please.
We could come to that at 5:02 with my report, if that's okay.
Right,
with yourself.
okay. No, that's grand, and we can have, so notionally we'll agree to close, but if we need to take a further action, we can take that. Your voice matters. We have that covered off in the paper. I'm content that we close that. Michelle and Paul are, because we're moving on. The wellbeing report. So we've got HMICS, we're waiting on the wellbeing frontline focus, and we have a paper. Are people content that we close that as a substantial item, but we continue to monitor it on an ongoing basis? Yeah. So we've approved that for closure. Placing together the updates for that are being taken forwards. Are people content that we close that? Yep. Sexism and equality. Emma, have you got a verbal update for us on that?
I have, Chair. So probably never good to start with an apology in some respects. So I know that the meeting had asked for specific data and metrics to come to this meeting, which I had given you an assurance that I would bring. Events have somewhat, I suppose, overtaken in the regard that, so you'll be aware, and through the update that Director Miller is going to give later on, that obviously there's a lot of work ongoing in terms of the broader workforce data. The aim for us is to ensure that the workforce data, then the indicators that are used or reporting is done at the various levels to enable us to interpret and define it around broader characteristics, particularly protected characteristics, that then will help us identify areas and trends for anomalies. So as much as the workforce data that Katie will go over and present and talk through today in her update is that the intended focus is that I will create, or the wider Policing Together work, I suppose, will create a degree of an alignment to ensure the consistency of reporting. Alongside that, then, within the Policing Together, there's the work being done around the cultural dashboard. So there is a natural overlap between some of the work that the cultural dashboard will seek to do and areas that we would be looking in terms of the sex equality, tackling misogyny. So I have data sets in terms of the overall workforce data, promotion data around protected characteristics, recruitment data, exit survey, PSD data. Some of that data, because of the nature of it, isn't available to be put into the public domain, but I can report into the Policing Together Oversight Board, which I know that Mr. Halpin had talked about last month. So with your permission, Chair, I have a written report to go through to the Policing Together Oversight Board for reporting with some of the data sets that we currently have, pending then the definitive around the alignment of the workforce data and the cultural dashboard, and for us to figure out how sex equality, tackling misogyny better aligns. So whilst we've got the data in terms of the promotion, actually from a sex equality, tackling misogyny perspective, I'm more interested in the representativeness of the candidate pool and then the subsequent flow through, if that makes sense, as opposed to necessarily the broader data sets in terms of how many people we have in each particular position. So having spoken with Director Miller, what we would like to see is that the workforce data sets would then be used to identify the issues of concern that would then be almost tasked to the sex equality, tackling misogyny group to develop the broader insights, the action plans and the problem solving activity to deal with the underlying issue. So it's not, I apologise, it's not the metric update that I had hoped to provide, but what we're trying really hard to do is make sure we bring effective and reliable data to meetings to actually drive, I suppose, valued activity as opposed to a whole lot of activity that doesn't directly address the underlying causes of some of the issues that we're seeing manifesting in behaviours that fall below the standards, or indeed reports to colleagues. So, but happy to take any questions or provide any further reassurance at this stage, Chair.
Okay, Emma, that's really helpful, and I think what it's important for committees like ours to do is be able to take a step back and reflect and have a broader picture and a wider picture, looking for evidence, and evidence of effectiveness as well as evidence of outcomes. And at that time, we understand it takes time, and I believe we should be measuring once, but using that data for a number of factors rather than constantly feeding the beast. So what you're suggesting, I think, sounds reasonable. I'm just going to check with my board member colleagues that they're content that we put, and we obviously have an eye to that, but if we have a more comprehensive overview, then that I think would give us a more effective way of looking at what the picture is and how we analyse. Michelle, you also content that we close that and put it in, and we can obviously, we will all have an eye to, and none more so than you, Emma, to making sure that we're continuing to make progress here. So thank you very much for that. We're on to health and safety. I think the action was to make sure that Surefire were being fully utilised. And I'm wondering if we can keep this, and Karen, please remind me at the end of the public meeting whether or not we agree to close this or not, because there were just some questions I had in the health and safety paper about whether or not Surefire is being fully utilised all of the time to protect the workforce. Your Safety Matters is included with the Health and Safety Manager's report. Are people content that we close that and continue to weave it into the Health and Safety report? Good stuff. So we agree to close that. And we've got the paper on the Strategic Workforce Plan, which would mean we would be proposing to close this item as well, which are members content that we close that since we've got the paper. Grand learning and development. So is there anything, so I fully appreciate that the learning and development strategy has been paused. Is there anything, because that's where we were going to take this, is there anything that anyone wants to update us on in terms of how that's going forwards? Alan?
Thanks, Chair. I was going to cover it in my main report, which I can do, but if you wish me to comment
No,
at this point, I
not
can
at all.
do.
Not at all. So
Thanks,
we'll
Chair.
make the presumption that we'll close unless we feel after your main report we don't want to. Target operating model, I think we're saying, is going to be a continuous oversight, but I'm wondering if we have we, and I'm now getting mixed up with the committees I'm on, so to share a one-page draft with people committee meeting colleagues. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. On that one specifically, and anything that relates to the revised model of policing work that's being overseen by the oversight group, I just wonder if there's an opportunity just to kind of roll the action into that to avoid duplication or any gaps across the piece, because I think that's where that piece of work's probably going to be surfaced in draft form before it later becomes formalised and could potentially be brought to people committee. So we don't have to decide now, but it's just possibly an opportunity to declutter the action log here and recognise where we're really going to be discussing the target operating model initially before it becomes formalised.
So I'm content with that, because I was wondering about the value of continuing that as being open. Michelle and Paul, are you content with that approach? Yeah, okay, so we'll close that. Thank you very much. And we're recommending closure of the mental health action because that's being swept up in the health and wellbeing programme, which I'm content that we do. Obviously, it doesn't mean an end to hearing about overall workforce wellbeing, in particular mental health. People content that we close that action on the action log? Thank you. Training. We have the paper tabled. In my mind, the question I have is, how do we know that all the mandatory and statutory training that people need has been carried out? So I'll carry that question through to the paper and look forward to having that dialogue. So I'm going to take that. We've got 2 to come back to, I think, at the end of the public meeting, and Karen can remind me if I forget. So thank you very much. Hopefully that has decluttered some of that. Decision on taking business in private. So in accordance with section 20 of our standing orders, I'm suggesting it's been suggested that we take items 6 to 9 in private. If members are content with that. And in terms of the running order, I'm going to suggest we swap items 7 and 8 so that staff side and trade union colleagues can be with us for 8.1, 8.2, 8.3. 8.4 and item 7 is for SPA and Police Scotland colleagues only, and 9.1 is SPA members and officials only. If people are content with that, then I'm going to pass as Katie with us now.
I am, thank you, Chair. Apologies.
Grand. No, don't worry. I think we're all having IT problems today, so it's just delighted that you've managed to get back on and be with us, Katie. So I'll hand over to the end of your railway report for you.
Thank you, Chair. So I will take the report as read, but if I could just take the opportunity perhaps just to pull out some of the pertinent points for me. Our Chief Constable has obviously made a very firm commitment in relation to the health and well-being of our colleagues. And this is very much backed up in terms of our people strategy and one of our very clear strands of work around health and well-being. Our commitment is to strengthen the coordinated approach to health, safety and well-being, which meets the needs of our people. So for 24 into 25, that's very much the focus around the action plans and the steps we're going to take. I'd like to draw your attention, if I can, to section 2, which outlines 2 critical contract awards. So that's for occupational health and employee assistance programme, both of which are very critical foundational pieces of support for colleagues across the organisation. I would like, if I can, just to thank all of the team members and wider colleagues who've been involved in that tendering. That was 12 months of work. They're quite complex contracts to land, and actually even when they're landed and agreed, there's a lot of complexity then around data and systems that needs to be worked through. In terms of the occupational health piece, so the provider remains as Optima. However, they have enhanced their offering quite considerably. So just drawing attention to kind of online portal 24/7, 365 days a year. But that moves very much to much more interactive solutions, so support for return to work, online appointments, and it really strengthens our ability around kind of reporting. So not only reporting for us in terms of contract management, but also for colleagues to be able to see update and status. There's also a personalised wellbeing platform that will be provided, and actually that has live chat function as well, so that ability to be able to interact in the moment. In terms of EAP, a new provider's been awarded, that's VivUp. The main parts of that contract for us is around accessibility of qualified health professionals, again 24/7, 365 days a year, but also adding that specialist support and advice being extended to around trauma, PTSD, bereavement, relationship difficulties, financial, etc. So an addiction. So we're very much focused on that kind of breadth of specialist advice. In addition to that, there's a stepped care model, and the idea behind that is that at that point of intervention, you get the very right treatment and support required. And there's also an extensive amount of line manager support within their offering. The only things I'd call out, if I can, within the report are 2.6. We have identified the evidence around TRIM, so our trauma risk management. We're now seeing a lot of evidence in relation to that and the positive impact it has. And 2.9, I'd call out ill health retirements and injury on duty. Whilst we very much focused on the colleague experience of that and looking at ways in which we can make it much more person-centric, we are still seeing a relatively high number of ill health retirals that particularly relate to emotional and mental trauma for colleagues. The only other point I'd call out is at 220, which has been one of the areas where we've really focused, which is on lifelines. And again, you'll start to see in that the team have worked really hard to try and provide very specific evidence on the impact of lifelines for colleagues across the organisation. I will pause there if I can. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Katie. Any questions or comments, Paul?
Yeah, it's just your last point. I'm looking at 2.12 and 2.13. and about a third of people that are retiring through ill health are for psychological reasons. And I'm trying to sort of extrapolate that to 2.13, which might not be a sensible thing to do, but the average is 20 years of service when someone is retiring. I'm curious, is it possible to separate those out so we get a sense of if the psychological reasons are a cumulative thing from work or if it's other things?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's really hard to separate that out. It's very much intertwined with work, life, kind of broader pieces. Yeah.
I'm sorry, as I was going on, I thought this might be a how long is a piece of string question. But yeah, okay. Thanks.
But it's probably something, as the services improve, as our data monitoring improves, it's probably something from an inquisitive point of view we should be noticing. And if people are having traumatic events at work, we should be wrapping around them so that it's not damaging to them. But you're right, Paul, there is the whole piece of society that's struggling just now at times. Michelle, anything from you? No. Can I ask, on that ill health retirement theme as well, the average age it's gone up from 45 to 48. And I fully appreciate the police pension regulations are particular to police officers. But given we believe in this country, the normal retirement age will be 68 and work's good for your health, I'm troubled by that young age that people are essentially being assessed as no longer fit for work. Is that so? It would be helpful, and it's maybe more a deep dive question. I'd be interested in the range. So to get the average of 48 and last year 45, we're going to have obviously some people older, but some people younger. So I think we're having a joint meeting with legal committee at some stage in the late summer, but I'm wondering if we could think about better understanding what's happening with the end stage of health and wellbeing of the workforce. I'll bring Paul in, then ask Katie to respond, and then I'll ask our colleagues from the Federation, ASPS, Unison and Unite for a comment.
Yeah, because it's just on that point. Has that gone up by 3 years in the last year, that average, because you've found alternatives for people that otherwise would have been retired?
Good point.
Yeah, I think there's a mix of things in there. Sorry, it's not a straightforward answer. I think when I actually see every assessment for ill health retirement, I read every assessment myself and the recommendation that then goes forward to authority. I think, the ill health retirement aren't assessing that somebody's not fit for work. If they're an officer, they're assessing they're unfit for officer duties. So that there's a very clear kind of evidence base that the team work through in terms of that criteria. These are the medical assessment we have, and then what that looks like. And they will very much take into account the response of the officer, whether or not actually there is something that we can do around a reasonable adjustment. So in which case modified or restricted duties start to come in. I think that it is it's not a straightforward picture in terms of the age or the reasons for this. There is no doubt in the ones that I'm reading, it's that cumulative effect of some of the policing roles. And as we've talked about in previous sessions, particularly that cumulative effect of trauma. I do see that coming through. But as I say, the team do work really hard where possible to find alternatives. But within a degree of that kind of medical evidence that we need to balance.
Okay, thank you. Anything from Dave from Unison is on? Anything? Derek? Dave, you're coming onto the screen. Does that mean to say yes, you do have a comment, or?
No, thank you, Chair. I mean, I think the only comment I would make is obviously this covers a lot of officers rather than police staff, which is obviously where our concern lies. But I'm aware of police staff members who have retired through ill health, through injury on duty, and through traumatic reasons as well, because we do have a lot of police staff who are front facing, especially in forensics, who are more likely to be the ones who face these traumas, as well as our staff in the control rooms. And obviously this paper I don't think really covers police staff, so it would be interesting to see those figures from our point of view.
Okay, I'll let Katie respond to that shortly. So Brian, anything from you?
Thanks, Chair. The only observations we'd make, this is indicative of greater pressures placed on fewer number of officers out there in the front line. And we've talked about the drip effect of dealing with traumatic incidents. If there's fewer officers dealing with that on a more regular basis, that'll impact on their health and mental well-being. But we are pleased to see the introduction or reintroduction of the use of lifelines, which will assist the frontline officers, but I'm afraid it's symptomatic of you have less people doing far more, and those numbers are shrinking all the time.
Okay, and we've got a paper on that later on, so we're interested in that discussion. Anything, and there's no obligation to speak, Rob, anything from you?
Just an interesting reflection. I was in Northern Ireland this week, meeting with colleagues from PSNI, their sister association, SANI. Despite being a smaller organisation, they've got more than double what we've got in terms of ill health retireals. You know, so that's just, you know, I'm just by way of comparison. It was an interesting one. I'm surprised by that. And really to the points that have been mentioned around about that potentially ageing workforce and what that might mean for us, and even the bit about being able to find people modified duties, how that potentially could then exacerbate what Brian's discussing, which is you know, having a smaller, even though the workforce remains the same, the operationally fit part of the workforce continues to get smaller. So there's a real challenge there across the kind of medium to long term around about how these different factors play off each other.
Okay, thanks. And then Derek, is there anything you want to add to that that's not been said?
Yes, I would. I just want to echo what Dave Ferguson mentioned about the report being all aimed at police officers in terms of the retirement. But I'd also like to put in the point that the new occupational health model, NEAP model, we're getting a good early feedback, although it's only recently started, that the process is actually quicker and slicker than what we had before. So even after only about a month in operation, it's good to see that as well, especially the occupational health model, because it was very lacking in our last contract. Thanks.
Okay, so that's helpful. Interesting from Rob about PSNI, very helpful and good to know, Derek, about the early feedback. Katie, thoughts on how we get assurance on ill health, retiral, injury and duty for police staff, please?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'll bring that forward, actually, if I can, with the team, just so we can do a bit of a deep dive on that. I think the rest of the paper does reflect officers and staff, so I do take account that it's just that bit that we will pull that out for you. Yeah,
that's helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Vicky.
Thanks, Chair. Just thought it'd be useful just to come in from a forensic services perspective. We obviously utilise the various mechanisms that are in place across Police Scotland, occupational health, the EAP, TRIM, etc., that we've spoken about and that are in Katie's paper. So we use those effectively, but what else we do internally is we look at the data in detail from police staff perspective. Ill health retiral numbers are relatively low, but each of those are obviously considered internally and with our P&D colleagues. We also use consideration of reasonable adjustments and modified duties, and we're also looking at a more proactive, preventative type approach, which we've shared at the Forensic Services Committee and at the previous People Committee around psychological supervision and trying to get into that more early intervention space in terms of trauma and the impact of that.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks very much indeed, and possibly other wider organisational learning. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move us on then to Jackie in terms of ill health retirement.
So actually staying in the same subject area, so that leads in very nicely from the discussion that's just taken place. So this report is specifically, so just to kind of highlight what both trade unions mentioned there, this report is specifically on officers, but that's because of the specific duty of the authority to approve ill health retirement and injury and duty for police officers that they don't have for staff. It's more an oversight role for staff, which the workforce governance team do have an oversight of the staff ill health retirements as well. So just to give that bit of context, this report is specifically on officers because it's about those delegated approvals from under the chief executive takes under delegation. So the report sets out what has happened between November and March last year. And because there had been the wellbeing report that we have just discussed, we didn't do any annual analysis because that had been contained within the wellbeing report. We will continue to work with colleagues in Police Scotland just to kind of streamline the reporting on ill health retirement, but recognising that we do have this need to report to the committee on those delegated approvals. I will stop speaking, but happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Your paper was quite full. Anything for Michelle or Paul? Are we content with the paper? We're content. Okay. Any colleagues? I'll not ask you individually, but if any of our colleagues from the ASPS, SPF, Unite or Unison want to speak, if you want to just raise your hand, then I'll bring you in. But we'll note that. Thank you very much, Jackie, and we'll then move on to Stuart, HMICS review of culture. Really important inspection that we've had.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I've just got a bit of an update of where we've got to with this at the moment. As you will all be aware, the HMICS conducted the review between March 2023 and September 2023, with the final report published on the 7th of December. From that, we've got 11 recommendations in 23 areas of development. And over the course of the following senior leadership board with the executive in January this year, DCC Spears and myself were involved in providing an update to them, and a working group was created on the back of that to look at the different areas. So that short life working group has met on various times now over the last few months. A lot of work is done about engaging with a lot of the business areas, but also trying to see where the crossovers are with some of the recommendations into other HMICS reviews, including vetting. There is some crossovers into these different areas that it's really, really important that we match those up. There has been a couple of meetings now with HMI, and we've mapped out the actions already planned within the joint strategy with two enabling strategies of people and policing together. So we're trying to match them into there as well to show where the action is actually taking place already. The recommendations approach that we've taken, we've held a meeting with HMICS to make sure they're happy about how we've mapped out the 23 areas for development. And there is a draft improvement plan that's been circulated to business leads. Obviously, the work that's ongoing with the Vision 2030 will be really important to some of this work as well. And once we've got some feedback from that, we'll be able to incorporate that into the improvement plan, which we're hoping to do for probably into June of this year. There has been recent, the National Police Chief Council have circulated an organisational culture questionnaire, and it's very, very similar to what we've seen in our review, and we're engaging with them at NPCC level. And also we've been fortunate enough to look at the Met's culture change programme about where the crossovers are, that anything we could take from that. So the next steps really for this response is the organisational culture improvement plan has got some key milestones in which will come into SPA and HMICS for progression, and a lot of the feedback will go through the Police Scotland People Board to ensure that we've got a fully developed plan with a view hopefully to come back to this committee in August, if that would be in order.
Okay, no, that would be really, really helpful. Thank you for that. There's obviously a lot of work going on, and we look forward to seeing that plan. And in particular, I think, Stuart, it's helpful to have the joining up piece so that we're looking at that whole system. Any comments or questions from Michelle?
Thanks, Chair. I mean, it's good to see the report. I suppose that my one observation is that one of the issues that's reflected in this report is something that is actually endemic across Police Scotland, and something that we've really been trying to tackle for quite a long time, which is an awful lot of activity is always designed and carried out in relation to responses to issues, whether those issues have been identified by external sources or indeed Police Scotland themselves. But what is always lacking is real clarity around targets, expectations, objectives, milestones, and resources required to achieve those milestones, and a means by which progress can be measured. And for every action plan that we see, whether it's violence against women and girls, whatever it is, the same issue comes up every single time, which is so a lot of activity described, but it's really light on, and this is how we're going to measure the extent to which we think we've achieved, and this is how we're going to measure the impact of all of that effort, so that we know whether we should continue in that effort or change our focus or whatever it might be. So it seems to me that there continues to be a big gap in terms of that part of any kind of improvement plan. So I just make the comment, but also I'd be interested in Police Scotland's response to that, given that it applies not just to this issue, but to pretty much every action plan that is developed.
Yeah, thank you for that. I see. I think that the aspect of this is culture. We've got developed culture dashboards, which is a key part of taking that forward, or how we can maybe measure some of that. I think what's probably really, really interesting in this review is that a lot of the stuff that's in it has been captured into a slightly or lesser extent in some other pieces. I mentioned vetting. I also think there's some there about in the wellbeing review as well, that we make sure that we match these up and I suppose can give results for more than one at the one time is what we're trying to do, and map them across the different areas. So I do agree sometimes activity plans can be really huge and not really have any end game, whereas I think with this we could look to try and converge it across the different reviews that are ongoing and make sure that we come up with an answer.
Yeah, I think measures of implementation and outcome measures are incredibly important, and I agree with what Michelle said, support that view that it's sometimes that it's the so what question and what practical tangible difference has it made. Okay, any others? So thanks for that. Look forward to getting the paper at our next meeting. Any other comments or questions from our staff organisations? No? Okay. Barry, over to you for your Voice Matters, please.
Thanks very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. In the interest of brevity, I'll keep my update really short and to concise to allow as much questions and conversation as possible on this really critical organisational issue. So the paper presented two core elements within that. The first is the outstanding ambitions within our implementation plan from 2021. So a really detailed stakeholder engagement piece and ambition owner engagement activity took place just to really properly understand the reality of where we were with these ambitions, the timescales, because we spoke about that in the last biannual update, that element of them being absorbed into other strategies and other organisational deliverables was considered. So a proposal was essentially tabled to the Chief Constable and the Chief Officer team on where we think that alignment looks like and how they will be absorbed into other deliverables. That was presented and supported that we, from a Your Voice Matters perspective, we would close that down. So really crucial, we keep our colleagues connected to that. So a communication will be sent out on Monday that will just articulate the feeling that these have been closed down. There's a Your Voice Matters intranet page now has been developed that essentially keeps colleagues connected to these deliverables, to these standalone deliverables. So, for example, the people strategy, strategic workforce planning, and the criminal justice improvement plan is another of those areas that have essentially inherited the ambitions from that plan. So as I say, supported by the Chief Constable and the Chief Officer team, and that communication will come out on Monday. Very much keen to measure progress, the sentiment of colleagues in terms of has this been delivered. So in terms of moving into the next iteration of the survey, which I'll come on to, that's a key priority, is understanding that kind of transition, that measurement of progress. Have we delivered? Have we done what we said we intended to do? In terms of the second element of the paper, Chair and members, setting the scene for the next Your Voice Matters survey, we're very much in the design and delivery phase of that. We're concluding our procurement process right now with our preferred supplier, hopefully identified into next week. In tandem, what we've been doing in terms of that kind of organisational readiness piece is a robust stakeholder engagement framework to properly understand what it is we need to really focus on this next iteration of Your Voice Matters. What are the themes, what are the questions that really matter to our people, and how do we translate that into real actionable activity, not just at an executive organisational level? How do we empower our leaders to own improvement activity at local levels and create those working environments that people can thrive in and be that best version of themselves? As I said, we want to track progress from 2021. That's a key element of that kind of sustained measurement, albeit we've moved on 3 years. But crucially, what we want from this next survey is data and insights that we can use to drive improvement at all levels across the organisation. The intent, which the Chief Constable has been very clear in our internal messaging and also at the SPA board last week, is that we're going to do this survey over a course of 3 years, so we can measure progress in a far tighter time frame than what we've done before. But also to enhance that, we want to enable pulsing capabilities. So we're looking at that just now, how we can get that kind of real-time measurement of how colleagues are feeling, what that progress looks like. I think Director Miller captured it really well earlier. She said, interact in the moment. That's what we want to do, get that snapshot across the organisation. I'll pause there, but welcome questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Members, any comments or questions? No, Michelle?
Yeah, so I suppose it's a risk of repeating myself. So I think what I heard you say was that the impact is going to be measured through a kind of ongoing program of surveys. Is that right? So it's because there's quite a lot of narrative in the right-hand column that talks about you know, we'll post updates on this on the website and we'll do so. But what I'm just less clear about again is the you know, how you measure the impact. So are your future surveys going to be the means by which you measure the impact, and are they going to be sufficiently relatable to the actions that you'll be able to see, you know, because staff have said this about action number A, then we know that either it worked or it didn't work or whatever. Because you know, if the survey doesn't do that, you've got an action plan that doesn't allow any of that checking against your proposed direction of travel, I think you've called it. So I'm just a bit unclear about that.
Thanks for that, Michelle. I think the way you summarised it is probably aligned to my thinking in terms of the survey as that starting point to get that understanding, that essential kind of benchmarking against ourselves almost. But what we want to do is enable that capability to be more agile, to do measurement in real time, emerging issues, trends, areas that we think we really need to understand closer than just waiting 2 or 3 years to do that measurement against. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Paul?
Yeah, it's a biannual report, so forgive my ignorance here, but does this just cover policing and SPA staff, or just cover policing, or does it also cover forensics as well?
So it covers right across the piece, Paul. Thank you for that. Yeah, and there's discussions at the moment with forensics colleagues in terms of the alignment and involvement in the next iteration of the survey as well. So that kind of universal, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, thanks.
Can I follow up with that theme of the employee, the voice. So it's not clear to me what people have said and what actions the organisation have taken. So there's a lot of narrative about future ambitions and future intentions, but I'm not seeing, these are the top 6 things that people told us. They want to wear red socks on a Friday, or they don't like the food, or they've got too much pressure, alongside this is what the organisation's done about it. And then I think the next natural look would be to measure, you know, improvement or deterioration. Is there anything in the paper, Barry, that's pointing me to the actions that have been taken as a consequence of the workforce voice?
So Chair, not in this paper. The last paper that was presented in November included a "you said we did" narrative. So we did that activity towards the tail end of last year. There's not been anything since, because the remaining ambitions are those longer term activities that we spoke about, where really there's not a lot. We can't really give any real granular detail about that, because it's ambitions, it's work that's going to take 2-3 years to deliver. I think your point is really important. I think right across the piece, in terms of from 2021 into this survey, there's a huge amount of organisational learning about how we deploy, calibrate the survey, how we communicate with our people. That's what the stakeholder engagement piece we're doing just now, which we didn't facilitate in 2021, to understand how people will feel part of this, will be compelled to participate in the survey, how we can help them understand how their voice has been heard. So it is a refreshed approach, by design, and all the kind of colleague voice, what they need, what they want from us to bring this to life has been incorporated into that. Or certainly that's the ambition, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Look forward to that. Any of our other colleagues wanting to comment on that? Rob?
Thanks, Chair. Well, one of our key weaknesses of long-standing in this area has been that we've never asked the same question set twice. So when Barry talks about tracking that impact over the longer term, that's for the surveys we've done in the past and the pulse surveys, we've never actually been able to do that with any kind of certainty, because we just haven't asked those same questions. So we would be wanting to encourage the service to continue a more longitudinal approach that allows a direct comparison from where we are in 2024 to where we are then in future years. The other thing we would encourage is for timeliest publication of the results once they are gathered. Again, the last time we sat on the results for almost a year before we published them, and that tempts people to think, erroneously I'm sure, that we're more concerned with managing the outcome of the results than we are actually with what people are saying to us. We would also like to see some really meaningful involvement of the owning areas with the actions that are to come out as a result. That shouldn't be something that's just simply kind of dictated. It should be something that's done in a kind of discussive way. And in order to do that, there needs to be the ability to disaggregate the results to a meaningful level, which was again one of the weaknesses from the last time we did this. For example, within Katie's area, P&D, the largest population of officers within that are within training, yet there was no way to disaggregate the results from training with the broader P&D family, and therefore quite a kind of skewed single approach became prevalent as opposed to one that's aimed at the particular population groups within an area. So be able to do that across the organisation would lead you to have a more meaningful response in these areas.
Okay, that's helpful. Before I come back to ask you, Barry, if that's the intention, I'm just going to check with the workforce reps if you've been involved in creating this next step. Yes, that's the answer, I think, from Barry's body language. So ASK, Feds,
Hope so, Chair, hope so.
Unison and Unite have been, this is not a surprise to them, and been involved in moving forwards. Okay, so that repetitive questioning and being able to trace back, Barry, is that part of your aspiration?
Absolutely, Chair. That's the intent, and the Chief's been really clear about that. Over the next 3 years, we will ask the same question set and measure and track improvement, but also that pulsing capability will allow us to kind of explore nuances and emerging issues, or anything that's really prevalent that we need to understand in more real time. Rob, thanks so much for your comments, and I remember obviously having those discussions when you were head of LTD about the kind of question set and the interrogation. We're working really closely with the people partners within Katie's team to make sure we have that ability to, what we present to the supplier when we appoint them is to really be able to interrogate the data and understand real kind of hot spots, which we didn't have that capability before. So that work is underway and absolutely will be key to us, building that kind of survey and the results to be able to kind of look at those hot spots. Some suppliers have described it as nuclear spots. I hope that's not the case. Thank you.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks very much indeed, and really look forward to seeing these improvements that are going to be made. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Moving on now, Mark from HMICS to give us an overview of the frontline focus. Good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm joined today by Jill Harper, who is the lead inspector and author of this report. I'll take the report as read, Chair, if I may, and I just want to just provide a bit of background and context to the report, and as well as maybe teasing out a few of the key findings before opening up for any questions, if that's okay. Thank you. So the inspection actually was initially commenced in spring of last year, but we paused it to allow more focus on the organisational culture and vetting work, which we've talked about already and we've presented previously to this committee. Eventually published in April of this year. There was initially three primary objectives to the wellbeing report itself, which was to identify factors which officers and staff consider support or impact their wellbeing, to assess the approach taken by Police Scotland in comparison to recognised guidance, and importantly engage with frontline officers and staff to assess their awareness of the Police Scotland approach to wellbeing. So just in terms of the methodology, I think it's important to cover this off because the frontline focus inspection type was a new type of inspection, which was meant to be very short, sharp and focused. However, the subject matter of wellbeing was an early recognition of that was of such importance that during our early findings, we realised that the original approach needed to be expanded, and the topic itself and the officers and staff deserved a more in-depth inspection and a more in-depth piece of work in terms of the field work. So we engage with organisations such as yourself, the Police Federation, Lifeline Scotland, other staff associations, etc., as well as considering professional guidance, attendance at meetings such as this, and importantly, interviews with key stakeholders and members of staff. And we went across the country actually for the field work, which was primarily interviews and focus groups. So we went up north to A Division, C Division and L Division, as well as taking into account national divisions such as C3 and Criminal Justice Services Division. So in total, 135 participants, over 37 interviews and 24 focus groups. So we really wanted to get a flavour across the country so that we could triangulate our findings and make sure that they were well evidenced and well supported. And what those findings were, which ultimately resulted in a number of recommendations, which is in the report, was an inconsistency in governance we found in terms of the level of resource and that governance, both human and financial resource dedicated to support officer and staff wellbeing. We did identify, and I think it's been covered this morning in some questions, a number of quite a significant effort, in terms of wellbeing support and initiatives, but a lack of an overarching strategy which is linked to those activities, including a lack of evaluation of those activities. So that resulted in the first recommendation, which would be that the Police Scotland should develop a wellbeing plan that has that level of appropriate governance and structure, reflecting the people strategy, and importantly, and I'll come on to this, to be delivered equitably across the organisation. So we also looked at organisational stresses and what people consider caused challenges in terms of positive wellbeing. And what we found was that the stresses that people talked about were organisational stresses primarily, so culture, resources, training, abstractions and rest time, or lack of ability to have sufficient rest time. and it was much more that rather than the operational stressors, which we talk about, which police officers deal with on a daily basis, and staff, of course, as well. So it was those organisational stresses that were cited as the primary factor, which were perceived to be impacting negatively on wellbeing. But what we found is that the wellbeing activity was directed towards the operational stresses rather than the organisational stresses, and again that resulted in recommendation 2, which is that Police Scotland should implement effective actions to understand and address those organisational stresses, and including those caused by perceived unfairness in application of processes and procedures. Resourcing came up time and time again, and I know it's a challenge for the organisation. We were told that the resourcing levels were increasing the workload, particularly on the front line, and having that detrimental impact on wellbeing. We're told that this resulted in an increase in sickness absence and officers seeking moves away from the front line to protect their own wellbeing, which of course consequently increases the demand on those remaining. Abstractions came up time and time again, no matter where we were in the country, in terms of abstractions for court, which I know that the Chief Constable's mentioned as recently as the last couple of weeks. Events in particular, disrupting rest days, again negatively impacting on wellbeing and recovery time, and then consequently unable to get time off at the times that officers and staff would need due to the low resource levels that remain on duty. We also found that we were told that OBL's operational base levels were not being consistently applied, and there was a perceived unfairness across the organisation depending on where you worked. And again, that resulted in recommendation 3 of the report, which is that Police Scotland should demonstrate flexibility in the deployment of resources across the entire organisation to reduce that impact or spread that impact. Moving on now to the kind of physical working environments, we identified an inconsistency in the standard of physical working environments, particularly where in frontline areas versus corporate and specialist areas. And again, that led to the recommendation, which is in relation to a state strategy having parity in terms of minimum standards, and also links, as Stuart Houston mentioned earlier, about other inspection work. So the organisational culture inspection also mentioned that perception of inequality. In terms of positive impact factors, though, there were quite a lot of positive impact factors from the organisation, which was the peer support and line management support, particularly in times of crisis, was really well received and really well commented on, and the policy to support this. So really, at times of critical need, then the organisation is absolutely there, which was really, really good to hear. There were policy changes which were intended to improve well-being. So, for example, the use of overtime, but that had sometimes unintended consequences in terms of officers being asked, we were told, to work without payment overtime. So that obviously was flagged up to us as well. And one of the areas that we also identified was a lack of use of wellbeing impact assessments, just in terms of any policy changes that would be made, and that's formed recommendation 5. So we've heard earlier on today, and also in our inspection, about training or lack of training in terms of people management and wellbeing, and I know that that's being addressed through the people management development programme as well, Chair. But it's more than that. It's more about getting dedicated time for face-to-face conversations and line management support, especially in rural areas, we were told, where actually that kind of dedicated face-to-face time is harder to come by because of the rural nature of supervision in some areas. So linked to that as well was recommendation 6, links to the training aspect as well, and that also takes us back to our previous inspection on training and development, phase 1 inspection regarding wellbeing conversations, and that takes us into recommendation 7 as well. We did have positive feedback in general terms regarding the occupational health and employee assistance programme provisions, which Director Miller has already commented on as being enhanced further still. So the recommendations are there in the report. There's 7 in total of them, and in terms of next steps, what we would ask for, and what we've already been engaging with Police Scotland in, is an action plan within 3 months of publication to address how Police Scotland is going to address the recommendations and areas for improvement, and also, and Stuart Houston mentioned it earlier on, that wider consideration of how the recommendations from this and other inspections, for example, organisational culture, strategic workforce planning, even going back to hate crime and training and development phase 1, can be incorporated into the overarching work and aligned to the published strategies already in terms of the people strategy and the strategic workforce plan. So we look forward to receiving the improvement plan, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Mark, that's very helpful, incredibly important piece of work, and obviously, as you've heard, covering probably most of our interests and in terms of moving that forward. So I think that this is going to be really helpful. Members, any questions you might have? Brian, I'll bring you in a moment. I'm just checking if Paul or Michelle want to. No, I just had one question, and that was about the wellbeing impact assessment. Is that something that's routinely done in other police services across the UK? And what does it look like?
Yeah. So, Chair, if I may, I'll bring in Jill Harper to this at this point. Jill did a lot of the kind of benchmarking work for the wellbeing report. Jill, are you available to respond to the Chair's question?
Yeah, yes, certainly. Good morning, everyone. In terms of the wellbeing impact assessments, that was something which was previously committed to in terms of the force signing up to the mental health at work commitment. We did try to identify where those were being used and struggled to do so that it does not appear to be something which is commonplace. I think that said, there is still value in pursuing that in terms of the identification of the impacts, probably unintended in many cases, and then working through how those impacts could be mitigated and tracked and managed. So no obvious examples to draw from, but we very much consider there's value in looking at some way of documenting and mapping the impacts and mitigations.
And the derivative of it then is something that Police Scotland had already committed to. Am I right? And yeah.
Yes, as have all the other organisations who had signed up to the mental health at work commitment.
Oh, very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Brian, any comments from you?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was just to identify the report didn't bring any surprises to us in the SPF, and we welcome the report because it corroborates exactly what we're hearing from the membership on a regular basis regarding the lack of information, training, instruction and supervision, whether that be basics of policing, the actual state of the estate in Police Scotland, which we've raised on numerous occasions, and obviously the big problem is the lack of operational resources at the front line and the impact that's having on the psychological well-being of all officers. So basically it's not well-being, it's welfare, as according to the Health and Safety at Work Act. Okay,
thank you very much indeed. So as you say, very important piece of work here, and a lot of it has been discussed, within the committee, with actions currently undergoing and to be taken, but look forwards to having the report within 3 months. So when does that 3 months finish, Mark? When are you expecting to have the action plan?
Thanks, Chair. So that we would expect that to be roughly mid-July. The report was published, I think it was 8th of April, so sort of mid-July. And I said, I know that Director Miller and DCC Houston are already working on a kind of overview of all of these inspections and how the actions that they've identified might address the recommendations across a number of inspection work that we've published to date.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks very much indeed. So over to you, Katie, on the same theme in terms of the way forwards for our health and wellbeing programme.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so this really takes us into the next paper. So we've welcomed the recommendations from HMICS, some of which obviously are far-reaching across the organisation and don't directly sit under the ownership of P&D, but nonetheless will work with colleagues. In addition to HMICS, or prior to the audit, we had actually engaged an independent expert in health and wellbeing across organisations, somebody called Dr. Sarah Taylor, who undertook an independent assessment of our health and wellbeing. And her approach is very much to look at kind of wellbeing ecosystems. So she's used a framework developed by East Anglia University and RAND Europe, which effectively looks at 5 independent themes, which are outlined in 2.3 around the evaluation approach within the report. What we've sought to do then is to effectively take the recommendations from HMICS and the recommendations from this independent assessment, which landed at the same time, and to coordinate them into an action plan so that they kind of speak to each other, if you like. And that's found in section 211 of the report. So this is really us trying to align these two pieces of work into one space. I think what I would say is that whilst there are overlaps in terms of the recommendations, there are also some nuances. So Dr. Sarah Taylor particularly, I think, brings a strength around some of the evidence-based frameworks that we could look at. So, for example, she talks about investors and people, which now have a wellbeing framework, and that might be something we want to consider. She also talks about National Police Wellbeing Service have a blue light wellbeing framework as well. So there's various different evidence models that we're going to explore and determine what that looks like going forward. So I'm happy to take questions. What I will say is that the action plan that is outlined, I'm going to just call out, we have 5 members of staff in P&D who in their entirety are responsible for wellbeing, and therefore we will need to bring back to the committee a prioritisation of those recommendations. So just to call out that there is a risk here in terms of the resource available to deliver this. So I will happily take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for that, Katie. Members, any comments or questions? No. Paul?
Yeah, sorry. What exactly is a theory of change?
Yeah, thank you. So actually, I have to say that this too was new for me, but it's essentially looking at the aspirations that you've laid out and actually kind of what the reality is and how it lands. So it's making the connection between actually what steps you're going to take between that disjoin at the moment, and that came through HMICS as well, around that kind of intended impact versus the kind of the strategic ambitions. So what it actually feels like on the floor.
Right, grand, thanks.
I think that sounds as though it's going to be very, very helpful. Any other comments from our staff colleagues? Dave?
Yes, thanks, Chair. We also welcomed the HMICS report and the recommendations that come through, and we obviously welcome the wellbeing approach, the health and wellbeing report that Katie's speaking of, to move that forward. We have similar concerns to what the federations have, and it's not there's nothing new within that report that we have not been hearing for our members. Things like OBLs, for instance, are constantly quoted to us, and we don't recognise them. They don't seem to be agreed anywhere. They're not written down anywhere. Yet our members are constantly being told they can't get annual leave, they can't get time off because of OBLs. So we'll welcome the move forward with this, and obviously keep a close watch on what's going on.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Any other comments or questions? Rob?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just reflecting on the comments of the Chief Constable at a recent conference when she spoke about being shocked at the lack of frontline focus, so I think this work starts to point us back in a direction where that focus is renewed and re-established within Police Scotland. I think that's a really helpful thing. Really welcome the approach taken by HMICS. And the ability to kind of call out the elephant in the room about the impact on officers on the front line, and I've no doubt this will be challenging work as it moves forward, but it's work that's necessary, and we'll have our full support.
That's helpful. Thanks very much indeed. Can I just ask about OBL, and are they all defined for areas, and is that a barrier to people getting routine annual leave in our Police Scotland staff? No. No, maybe we take that as an action, is that we have an update on the definitions of OBLs for, across the organisation, and whether or not there's an impact or evidence of an impact of people not being able to take leave as a consequence of that. Tom, we're moving on over to you, please, in terms of our biannual update on Policing Together.
Morning, Chair. I'm representing Director McMahon and providing this update this morning.
Good, very welcome. Apologies, Tina, I hadn't appreciated that. Welcome and thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much. So I will take the report as read. The report itself continues to evolve and develop, and we will continue to improve this report based on feedback and evolutions within the data space itself. So the report provides updates in relation to mainstreaming and delivery against the policing together and joint equalities outcomes for policing. So this particular report covers the period between October 23 and March 24. It's also part of a wider suite of performance reports that we would take to Policing Performance Committee as well on a quarterly basis. And the mainstreaming section of the report, you'll see that it provides key strategic updates linked to policing together. We've also included some reporting against the joint equalities outcomes for policing, and that then allows us to comply with the legislative reporting requirements and provide examples of high-level progress at national and local levels. And we've also included some key impacts and next steps. As well as the report, I think it's probably quite important to mention at this point, there's some other broader work ongoing that's covered within the cover paper. So there's a bit of gap analysis ongoing at the moment as we move towards the final 6 months delivery of the equalities outcomes, and then working towards refreshing those equalities outcomes as per our legislative requirement. And within the cover paper, we've kind of outlined there some of the next steps at 1.44 that we will be undertaking really between June and to take us to publication and design of the new equalities outcomes for April 2025. Other key development pieces covered within the report itself, we've already touched on work in relation to the development of the cultural dashboard. So that's touching across various areas of policing at the moment and lots of engagement ongoing with colleagues, particularly in P&D, to help develop that dashboard. Within the report, there are some highlights I would pick out, which are welcome improvements. So we are seeing improvements, for example, in detection rates for sexual crime and increased use of our disclosure scheme for Domestic Abuse Scotland, which is really positive. So we're seeing increases there in terms of power to tell up 25% when we look at that compared to last year, and right to ask up 14%. The document also touches on some positive engagement around and training around Empower Hours. There's been a number of facilitated sessions across the piece, and the document contains some feedback from colleagues in relation to that, and then some real positive activity around Truth to Power sessions. The report is fairly comprehensive, continues to improve and develop, and I'm happy to pause there and just really take any reflections or comments or feedback. Thank you, Chair.
Tina, thanks for that. As you say, the report is incredibly comprehensive, outlining a lot of narrative, but good to see dashboards being developed and moving forwards, and look forward to seeing that, improved reporting. Any questions or comments from members? No? Okay. Any comments from our staff organisations? Okay, noted. Tina, thank you very much indeed for that. We're now moving on, I think, Katie, over to you in terms of the people strategy and SWP.
Thank you, Chair. Take the paper as read. I think if I can, I would bring the attention to board members of the appendix, which really lay out the detail of implementation of SWP and people strategy for year one. Being very honest, that the challenge in these implementation plans is bringing together the threads of all of the various pieces of work that are happening in the people agenda across the organisation. So not just people strategy and strategic workforce plan, but broader than that. So thinking about Emma's work in tackling misogyny, thinking about policing together, our annual police plan commitments, etc. So I'm happy to take any questions, but certainly appendix layout where we see our priorities for the first year. Thank you.
Comments or questions from members? People content that it's capturing where we are, and I think we recognise the work that's going on, Katie, in terms of trying to pull everything together so that we can have, you know, meaningful measurements of the outcomes. Any comments from our staff side colleagues? No, okay. So in terms of our new reporting systems and structures, when are you expecting us to see a new improved data-rich reporting system?
Yes, so one of the agenda items, in fact, I think it might be the next one, has the strategic workforce dashboards and the new look to those, which are very much aligned to people strategy and strategic workforce plan themes. So perhaps I can pick up on that in the next agenda item, if that's okay, Chair. Thank you.
Yep, okay, that's grand. And if I'm not seeing anyone else wanting to come in, do you want to, will we move on then, Katie, on to that, please?
Thank you. So I think what I would say is hopefully board members would recognise that a considerable amount of work has been undertaken in respect of our reporting. I think more broadly what I would say is that this is a first iteration that you can see within Appendix, which effectively is a new look strategic dashboard that align to the people strategy themes and the strategic workforce themes. What we do recognise is that within the narrative, there's further work for us to do with Tina's team around that kind of layering, the nuancing of data, so that we can really start to bring that to life. We've worked hard with Tina and her team on completing DPIAs so that we can start to move people-related data across to her team so that they can do the production and the analysis. So we're working through that at the moment. I think what I would say with regards to the new dashboards is that we have tried to bring to life some of the nuances and the evidence, but we do know there's further to go. I'm happy to take any questions or feedback from committee members as to whether or not they are thinking that the dashboards are now kind of hitting the mark in a better, stronger way for you. Thank you.
Okay, Michelle, Paul, any thoughts or comments or content with the direction of progress?
Yeah, I like the dashboard. I think it's presents information in a very accessible fashion.
Yeah, and I think moving over time, so looking at improvements or otherwise over time and being able to monitor that, I think will be helpful. And the proof of the pudding is going to be in how we manage to capture that data and have the evidence in front of us in terms of evidence of impact principally.
Chair, if I'm able, could I just show appreciation for one of our team members, Peter Blair, who I think may be on the call, but Peter actually leaves Police Scotland next week after a considerable career with us, both of us as an officer, but then also in a civilian post working within P&D and various other teams. And I'd just like to extend my thanks to him for all the work that he has done on trying to move some of our data and reporting forward. Thank you.
No, thanks, Katie. We can maybe echo these thanks, because it's incredibly important that actually we're managing to monitor and measure and have that. So what difference in practical terms is it making for that? Anything from our staff side colleagues? Any comments? No, okay, Katie, thank you for that. Look forward to seeing further iterations. I think we're still with you. And
sorry, are we moving on? Because I think we were only asked for comments on the format. Can I ask a question on the actual report?
No, apologies. Yeah.
Thanks. No, I'm curious about the officer numbers, and firstly, the 16,355. Is that rock bottom now, or are we still going to have to shed staff or officers rather, in order to meet our restructuring requirements, whatever it is, the budgetary requirements.
So in terms of officer numbers, we're working extremely hard with ACC Houston's team to look at intakes, so to be more flexible on intakes, so that we can continue to grow officer numbers against the backdrop of scenario planning for leavers, particularly in the space of retirement. With regards to staff, we do cover that, Paul, in the paper on VRVER. And where we're at, we have a slight shortfall at the moment in terms of the pay bill reduction that we were seeking. So perhaps if that's okay, we could pick that up in that paper.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
And the annual turnover rate, how does that benchmark with other years?
I'm wondering if Peter's still on the call, if I could bring him in on that.
Sorry about this.
No, that's okay. You might well have signed off. If he's not on the call, Paul, are we able just to take that away and provide that?
Yeah,
sorry,
thank you. Maybe just have that emailed round to members and attendees.
Yeah,
I think that would be helpful. So unless there are no other questions from members or comments from our staff side colleagues, I'll move us on now to the policy review, Katie.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So the policy review, so this is a framework that we've put in place to seek to try and prioritise the policies that we're going to take forward in terms of review and redevelopment of them. This is not only so that we've got a clear organisational path for this, but also to support our trade union colleagues to manage their facility time and their capacity to do this. I think it's probably fair to say that there are a number of conflicting priorities from across the organisation around policy development, some of which are legislatively driven, and therefore as an organisation we need to respond to, but some of which are actually kind of at the request of the organisation. So we are holding this policy framework. We do talk to the trade unions, particularly as well as our staff associations in relation to this through our JNCCs. But it's really trying to just get that very clear prioritisation and agreement across the organisation as to what that programme of work looks like. The two that I would call out at the moment that we're particularly working hard on are our organisational change procedure. So working hard with Unite and Unison, so this particularly impacts staff, obviously, and also grievance informal resolution. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie, and it's good to have things laid out, but also to see some progress in terms of, I know it can sometimes seem like an insurmountable hill to keep. That's just as you get to the top, you see another one, but actually it's quite good to see the progress that's been made in a lot of the reviews, and that's helpful. Members, any comments or questions on the, clearly it's an operational issue in terms of what policies have been reviewed, and there is something about doing it in a meaningful way rather than promising the earth and then not managing to deliver it. So I'm not seeing any questions. Michelle?
Yeah, sorry, just and it's I've maybe missed it, but do you have a kind of template for criteria that you would want to see included in all the policies? You know, so given some of the action plans around you know, anti-discriminatory practice, etc., I just wonder whether there is something that is like almost a checklist to make sure that every policy either has some reference to it or is consistent, so that there is that consistency across the board. And I'm just wondering how you achieve that, you know, whether you have a template for it or a, as I say, a checklist, or whether it's, you know, each one is a kind of organic evolution.
Yes, thanks, Michelle. So I think there's two parts to it. One in the appendix is actually a kind of categorization that we've come up that gives us a bit of a scoring mechanism to help prioritise, and that's obviously done in dialogue with stakeholders. In terms of the piece you were talking about, that's done through the equalities impact assessment, the human rights impact assessment. The bit that we do need to strengthen and work on, and we are coming up with, is the so what of the policies. So coming back to, yes, we might be legislatively compliant, but what's the lived and colleague experience of that policy? So that's the bit we need to sharpen up on.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from our staff side colleagues? No, but noting, or Rob, does that mean you want to come in if I see you on camera, Rob?
Sorry, Chair, I was just around about the approach that we're taking now with training across multiple courses to try and get us up to that 16.6 level. I'd be interested if there was any impacts around about, other force training that's ongoing and how we're managing those, because that's quite a significant change from previous approaches, and it's one that potentially, if it's properly resourced, could be a really positive thing, I think.
I'm muted,
sorry, Chair, I think
yeah, I was muted. Yeah, the comment you were making in terms of the numbers of officers, was it? In terms of
just about the recruitment and training of officers over staggered courses, which I believe that's a departure from what we've done in the past. I think that's something that's as I say, could have a really positive impact. But also, it's just about what are we potentially, in order to achieve that, is there any kind of deficits that we're having to manage in other training products, for example?
Okay, so you're thoughtful about that. Alan, are you wanting to give us a view on that?
Yeah, Chair, I can give Rob some context and yourself and others if that's helpful. So, Rob, it's a good point. Obviously, as was mentioned by Director Miller, we're going to look to recruit significant numbers. We're also going to concurrently deliver a course at Jackton at Tullyallen at the same time, some 250 recruits or thereabouts. That's never been done before in the history of the organisation. That will bring some challenges, and we're working through those at the moment. I can't give you explicit details because the team right now are looking to do that. We've been supported by colleagues across the organisation, particularly flexing modified officers and staff members who maybe can help us in times of higher need. My ambition is not to detriment any other part of learning and development, because obviously every part of it is important, obviously, to support staff and officers. So I can't give you definitive impacts, but we're definitely having to be really flexible in our approach. But I can't also give you a definitive answer that we won't be able to potentially reduce something in order to make sure our recruit numbers are coming through at the right levels, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and it's going to be interesting to see the outcome of this. But what I find helpful is to see that commitment to look at more flexible ways of training and recruitment, and changing that approach, and the proof of the pudding will be in numbers and ongoing evaluation. So that is grand. Thank you very much for that. Dawn, we're over to you in terms of the Q4 end of year health and safety report.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take the papers as read, but I will pull out some of the sort of key parts that I would like to highlight. One of the positive things that have come out of the data that we've had over the last 4 years is that we've actually seen a reduction in the number of RIDDORs in relation to assaults. That being that we've actually seen an increase in the number of reports we're getting, but we're actually seeing a reduction in the number of serious RIDDOR need there. So that's a positive outcome. There has also been a reduction in the number of reportable injuries. There's been, however, a 36.2% increase on last year's figures due to assault, which is something that I'll be working with Wellbeing and Your Safety Matters to try and address. We have seen a 25% decrease on last year for any other types of incident, and hopefully we've been talking about dashboards going forward, and I'll be able to utilise some of the new dashboards as well that Tina and her team have developed, which is great news for us, and that'll help us to rationalise the data to be more effective. And we're looking at how we utilise those new dashboards to scrutinise that data more effectively, to provide yourselves as a committee with any information we gather and look at trends more focused. However, that said, we still can use the data we've got at the moment to do that. And again, during arrest and custody is still shown as one of the biggest concerns, and there are discussions ongoing around that in regards to OST and about how we can take the learning from that to improve training. I would like to point out an error on slide 7 on this year's data, a typing error. I don't know how that's happened, but the RIDDORs in terms of during arrest and custody are nowhere near 132. They're actually 41. The figure 132 is the total in the 5 years. That's been copied wrongly from the dashboard. But I did let the Secretariat know and make her aware of that. Another couple of things to highlight is the new certificate of assurance is up and running, and I have provided a draft expectation of timeline. A reminder that the theme this year is risk assessment and implementation of controls. And so the health and safety advisors should have already been in contact with their areas in due course. However, we are starting with P division after the pilot that we did with A and OSD. So we'll be starting that process this week, and we'll have a stop and review as well, just to ensure that the process is as smooth as it can be. As a result of this new certificate of assurance, we're actually looking to provide some of our own team members in health and safety some training around the ISO 45001, which is the health and safety management system. And that's being considered at the moment. I think the learning that we'll gain from that and that we can share with the rest of our team, but also I've spoken to colleagues in the wider force, particularly in risk and assurance, who said that they would also benefit as well from that learning. We're also reviewing at the moment in terms of scopes and storm information in relation to dangerous dog activity. That seems to be on the increase, and we are again liaising with colleagues internally, but also down south to deem any best practice in which we can utilise to support a robust risk assessment process in relation to that. Albeit we do realise that some of these incidents will have unique traits, and but we are keen for our officers to be involved in how we use the hierarchy of control in order to protect themselves in those situations. So meetings are in place with OSD next week to look at that. We've also got our short life working groups that are running at the moment in relation to other risk factors, organisational risk factors, such as lithium-ion batteries and nitrous oxide, now that that has become a Class C drug. And we've got some concerns around storage, transportation and disposal of that, particularly the quantities that they are coming in terms of seizures. So lots of work carrying on in that space. Members will also see the work plan that has been an offshoot of the 3-year strategic action plan that you will have already seen. This is the aspiration of the team for the next 12 months. And again, hopefully some of the learning that we'll get from the ISO 45001 training will help inform the outcomes of this work plan, and will hopefully answer some of those so what questions as well that we've been discussing throughout today. The big thing for us as well as a team is the learning side, and we want to really focus on training delivery and how we condense some of the output and where we need to focus our efforts. And while we're aware that we do have a need for compliance, we also are aware of the time challenges for accommodating CPD. So therefore, we're trying to ensure that we can deliver that training in a blended approach through WebEx, through Teams, and also where we might need to do some specific face-to-face training. But the key for us is to hit those P1s. And ideally, we're looking to start around the risk assessment training and the designated safety coordinator roles. And that's in line with our key area in the action plan 6.1 and from our strategic plan. It's also proposed, that the outcomes for the work plan are shared with the People Committee on a 6-monthly basis so that we can keep you abreast of the outcomes and how we're getting on with that. We're also looking to recruit at the moment as well, which will also help to support the outcomes of that plan. Just to give you a brief update on the Surefire. So the Lessons from Operation Moonbeam have been addressed in terms of there is significant deployment now being made to those officers who are attending events and parades. We have had some issues with stock replenishment. However, they have been, they are now back on stock, and we are making sure that deployment is going out as a priority to those where noise is actually prevalent and taking priority. Various comms have gone out through various forums, through emails to divisional commanders, through the local committees, and also through the intranet in regard to Surefire and how we anticipate this to be used, how it should be looked after, and also how to acquire it. The data that you'll see in the slides provided is actually from April, but I do have some updated statistics from this month. Some have seen a real significant uptake since those stats that you see were produced in April. I particularly like to highlight that L Division have now seen an increase up to 84% in a month. So I think that has been down to perhaps their involvement in some of the operations that have been happening around the football areas and things like that. But it's good to see that it's recognised and it's being used appropriately. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Dawn, thanks very much indeed for that fulsome report. I'm going to go to my colleagues to see if there's any comments or questions. Paul?
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. What's the reason? I mean, that's a 20% increase in assaults from what I can gather. Is there any underlying reason for that?
Like I say, we're trying to take a sort of deeper dive, and I think that perhaps there's a running theme, and I'm sure that the unions may and the trade unions may agree again that there is perhaps some to do with the deployment and how many officers are there and things like that. But we will need to use the new dashboard information to help utilise and rationalise that data to really focus on that. However, we are, as I say, working with colleagues alongside in our OST to see if there are any issues around training and how we deliver that training effectively.
And there's no specific incident or sequence of incidents that have kicked off, you know.
I mean, we have highlighted during custody and arrest as an issue that we've seen an increase, and again we're really focusing on where we might help support officers with that.
Okay, and the other question I've got is what would you define as a near miss for the assaults? Is that just someone has tried to assault you and they've not been successful?
Yes, absolutely, and we're really looking to split that out to really understand what we can learn from that. We're really trying to push the message about near miss reporting as well, to really allow us to be a little bit more proactive in terms of how we look at risk assessment and provide a lot of support and advice where we can. But utilising the knowledge and experience from our colleagues within the force to help us to get that message right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thanks. Members, any other questions from members? Can I'll bring you in shortly, Rob. Can I just, there's a couple of questions. The dangerous dogs, is that to do with the XL bully, or is that just dangerous dogs?
I mean, I think that obviously we've seen quite an increase in terms of the XL bullies, and that's probably highlighted the issue, but we are aware that there are other dangerous dogs under the legislation. So I think it's just highlighted it again as something that we need to really focus on, trying to ensure we've got all the mitigations that we possibly can and make sure that the protection of the officer from our perspective is our priority, albeit there is the reputational risk around the welfare of the animal. But I think from health and safety's perspective, we're looking to see how we can put a robust process in place alongside the dynamic risk assessment that will have to take place at the scene.
No, absolutely, and obviously it's distressing for the officers when they have to shoot an animal. And so it's the psychological as well as the physical piece. So that's interesting. You said quite a bit about Surefire, so thank you very much for that, Dawn. Am I being too bold to say supply is fulsome and the policy is clear and every single member of police staff and officers who need access to them can get access to them?
Yes, and what we've done is we've done a lot of comms around. I think what you might have seen, or hopefully what our officers and staff have seen, is a real push in terms of the communication around it and the importance of it. And every single division now has a SPOC that will collate all the information. And then that will go to digital division for them to deploy the right piece of equipment for the right person. That is being hand delivered to the division to make sure that it's going to the right people, albeit we have seen some slight issues around that where and that information is going on to scope, so we have a record of who has received the kit, but we're tightening up hopefully around that and making sure that we are in constant communication with the digital division to see how progress is taking place in that space.
Okay, Emma, were you wanting to say something about Surefire?
Yes, Chair, it's just, if you don't mind, on behalf of Tim, who I know has been heavily involved in terms of the work, because the majority of it had originated out of one of the ops that he obviously had been overseeing. It's really just to add, I suppose, there absolutely is assurance that access is available. The challenge I think that has been experienced is just the availability of some specific sizes. Because I think medium in particular is a very common size, so those would probably run out quicker than other elements have. So it's the resupply has been requested around those. So whilst everybody may not have physically received it, absolutely we know what's expected, and there are really effective plans, to be fair, in place. So but just in terms of practical availability, in terms of hands-on, that may just has been slow time hampered.
So I don't know to whom my question is being presented then. When will we have an adequacy of stock that means every single member of staff can get the protection that they are entitled to?
If I could come in there, Chair,
Yep.
My understanding is that the stock it's en route. There is an 8-week timeline, but it's been ordered in the last sort of 4 or 5 weeks, so it should be with us soon. But again, anyone who is not being deployed out to an event that this is required will be sort of set aside to allow someone who is requiring that piece of equipment in regard to an event or an operation that says in the risk assessment will take priority. So there is kit there. It's just that, like Emma said, we're replenishing the size. It's more of a size issue than anything, but then that is being replenished as we speak.
Okay, that's helpful, thanks. So Karen, can we keep that as an open action, please, on the action log in terms of making, until we have the absolute assurance that the replenishment is there. I've just got a couple, sorry Rob, thank you for being with us. Just a couple of questions for me. The nitrous oxide, is that a question of gaseous escape, or is there a size of container that's also a problem in terms of risk for the officers?
Yeah, so there's a number of concerns that we're trying to manage at the moment. So one is, yes, of course, that nitrous oxide leaking during transportation is supposed to be segregated in terms of being on a, in a practical van or transport that is designed for that transportation. But we are talking about anything from a small thing to the larger cylinders. So we're seeing all sizes in all eventualities. We are also in consultation with the Procurator Fiscal in terms of the ask of what we might have to store, given that this is unlikely to end up in a court of law to show evidence, and it's likely that it'd be a digital image that would be shown. So we're trying to negotiate when we can at what point can we destroy that as well. So we're not holding on to mass amounts of this, especially as we don't particularly have the space within our production areas to store it correctly.
Okay, and then the final question from me is about driver training, officer safety training. Where are we with that? Have we got, and it might run into Alan's paper, have we got all of our staff with the prerequisite training for them to do their jobs, in particular looking at officer safety training and driver training?
Could I go to Alan for the response for that, Chair, if that's okay?
Yes, you can. Yes,
thank you very much.
Or Alan, I'm equally happy to run it into your paper.
Whichever you would prefer, Chair. I'm happy to cover it off first. So in terms of OST, firstly, can I maybe answer the question that came in regarding officer injuries a little bit more deeply. So just to give hopefully some assurance, I chair the use of force monitoring group for the organisation, where we look at use of force in every sense, and rest assured that we look for patterns, we look for injury rates, and we look for learning in there, and we use our APU colleagues in that space to help us to really do a deep dive. So it won't surprise anybody in the call that the three common areas where officers are assaulted, and including members of staff in custody environments, are on point of contact in the public arena, in custody facilities, and in taking an individual in and out of a police cell van. So those are our three areas of focus, and to give some assurance, what we do is we're looking for continually new tactics, new ways of doing our business to keep everybody safe, not just the person in our custody, but also our officers and staff members. Allied to that, we're looking for any kit improvements that we can make in that regard as well, but we also look for learning elsewhere across other different policing agencies in the UK and elsewhere. So it was just really to answer that point that came up in conversation, which is hopefully helpful. As I say, what we're all trying to do is drive down any injuries, both to officers, staff, and members of the public who are in our care and custody. So in terms of your comment regarding and question regarding operational safety compliance levels, they have dropped. So before the training pause that we had in December, January of this year, we were sitting across the majority of the organisation in the mid to high 90s. Unfortunately, that has dropped as a result of a number of factors, but that has included the pause in OST training that we put in place in December and January. It has taken time to pick that back up, but we are currently working hard and offering out as many spaces as available. One of the challenges, and it's been well rehearsed by comments already in the meeting today, is that it's not just the ability of training spaces, it's the ability for divisions and departments to release staff to conduct that face-to-face training, which is a 2-day event. So we continue to work hard with our RDU colleagues to make sure that every officer and staff member who needs that training gets access to it. And we will, as always, prioritise those who are front-facing. Not to say that every officer and staff member who needs it will not get it, but we will prioritise those in local policing and front-facing roles. So, Chair, that's the first question. I'll pause at that point in case you want to come back.
Yeah, so when will that be? When will we get back to the high 90s, Alan?
That's a good question, Chair. I'd love to give you a definitive answer, but if it's okay, I'll come back with further stats and reporting at a future committee, if that would be possible. So
that would be helpful, and it would also be helpful to understand in that paper the decision that was taken to pause training in December, the decisions that were made, which I assume would have had an understanding of the consequential impact of that pause of training. So I'd be interested to know about the decision making in terms of what estimates were taken as to when there would be full recovery in that.
Absolutely, yeah, we can absolutely cover that off, and we do have estimations. I don't have them to hand here as to about the compliance levels across the year, but apologies, I don't have them to hand with me at this point in time, but we can definitely do that.
And that would be helpful. And before I finally bring Robin, driver safety training, or the driver training, not driver safety training?
Yeah, so thank you, Chair. So it's a well-rehearsed, and I'm looking at Brian, who will no doubt smile at me down the lens of the Teams meeting. But yeah, the challenge we have is we have a finite number of staff who are qualified to deliver this expert level of training. both in advanced driver training, but also in standard response driver training. We have a backlog in both areas, which is significant. If I look at advanced driver training right now, if I did nothing else today, it would take me 11 years to clear the backlog. That's the true facts of it. However, we have a remedy that we're currently progressing. I'm progressing with executive colleagues to look at fixed term contracts in that space to bring in suitably qualified ex-members of staff who can help us very quickly to remove that backlog, because it affects both affects road policing, it affects surveillance officers in our SCD environment, and also our armed officers in certain armed roles that we have within armed policing. So right now it's significantly challenging, but there's not a space goes unused within Police Scotland. There's 100% capacity delivery. Unfortunately, the demand outstrips the supply that I have to provide it. But as I say, to give assurance, I can come back again to the next committee if you wish and give you an update.
I think, and the update will be helpful if it has an end date. And I'd rather know it's 11 years than not know. But it would be helpful if you have a solution that's going to bring that down, so that we can, keep the safety of our workforce, but also the public at the forefront of our minds. Thank you.
Of course, Chair, I'll do that, no problem.
Thank you very much. Rob, you were coming in on, I think, an issue that Paul had raised. Thank you for waiting.
No, of course, thank you, Chair. And yourself and Alan have touched on many of these issues, so I'll just quickly summarise this. So effectively, the work undertaken by Tina McLucas and her team have established really clearly, with probably a UK leading data set, the preventative effect of officer safety training. So actually, when you look at the number of assaults that have gone up, and the fact that the likelihood of the injury associated with that is more severe, you could directly attribute that to the fact that we chose to pause that training for a month. Alan's team trained between 1,200 and 1,400 officers every month in officer safety training. So that's 1,200 to 1,400 that didn't get that training. And then the knock-on training lag and associated skills fade for everybody thereafter until you get back up to your high 90s around about that. So Chair, when you ask the question around about the kind of the information and decision making about when we get back to that, also what we should reflect on is any decision to pause officer safety training is likely to have the effect of officers being assaulted, and those assaults are more likely to result in them being injured, and that's where in future we might want to consider very carefully any decision to potentially pause that essential training.
Yeah, I'm muted. Thank you very much for that comment, Rob. I'll come back to that in a moment. Brian?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's just to confirm and concur with what Rob just relayed. Obviously, the concerns were the lack of the suspension of training for those 2 months, but that is obviously financially driven because of the available resource to cover that really busy period that the force is going to face over the festive period. So we understood the decision that the training department took, but we realised that would come with consequence. And on the driver training aspect, I welcome the honesty now and transparency where we are. And you wouldn't be surprised if I always say that I'll obviously keep that to the forefront of Mr. Gibson's attention, but we're working together to address that significant problem. Thank you.
That's really helpful, thanks. And you're absolutely right, Brian. I think it's much better to have concrete facts with a deliverable action plan than things perhaps not being quite as transparent. Alan, I hate to burden you with even more detail for this paper, but I wonder if you could also have a reflect on some of the comments that Rob has said, and include that in terms of we're not looking for a response just now from you, but to our next meeting we maybe can have a look at that, whether there's correlation or not, and what has happened with officer safety training and assaults.
Chair, of course, if I could just maybe comment that the wider ambition of releasing or stopping training was to release operational officers back into local policing, which was some 85 officers, perhaps even slightly more than that, at a time of enhanced needs. So I think it'd be wrong of me not to record that point at this point in the meeting, if that's okay.
No, absolutely. And in all of these areas, decisions that have to be made are always a balance of sometimes immediacy versus a more medium term. But I think looking at us being a learning organisation, it's helpful to be able to have time to reflect and think about doing things differently or the same next time in all of this. That is really helpful. So I think we're staying with you, Alan, please, in terms of, and this was the question, I think it's already been answered. Is all mandatory training, how do we know that all mandatory and statutory training has been carried out, and where are we percentage-wise with that being delivered?
Thanks, Chair. Obviously, as others have done, I'll take the report as read. I apologise for the length of it, but in discussion with officers before preparing the paper, it was deemed helpful if we gave a little bit of a background as to the function, what it does, and where it's came from. So I've tried to encapsulate that in the early pages of the paper. So I hope that's helpful to members to kind of draw a kind of history lesson, but also to bring us up to date as to what the function covers and where we dock into other functions such as the P&D function and OSD, for example. I've also spoke within the paper about another number of elements, including how we work with SCQF and SQA in terms of relationship with them, in terms of how they obviously support our training delivery. I've also spoke about the Strategic Learning Development Governance Board, who effectively on behalf of the organisation, that's chaired by DCC Spears, set to oversee all learning and development in the organisation, whichever part of the organisation delivers it. Particularly in terms of absorbability and prioritisation, which again is a theme that a number of colleagues have brought up this morning, is how we manage the impact of delivering the very best learning and development to the organisation, but obviously trying to do it against a challenging time where not everybody has the resource levels that they would wish. So I've talked through a number of different elements within the paper, and I've came to that point, as you've seen, in terms of mandatory training, and I've introduced the definition that we work to in terms of mandatory training. Interestingly, like other areas of Police Scotland, we also had to follow the trend in introducing a dashboard. So I very recently introduced a training dashboard, which has been launched across the organisation to allow divisions and departments and colleagues to really understand their own performance levels in terms of mandatory training and as to where they're at with that, such as OST. And we can drill down if need be into individual officer levels. But what that allows us to do as a function is to oversee that and then to escalate challenges that we might find and see once we analyse that, but also for individual divisions and departments to take responsibility for ensuring their officers and staff are actually undertaking that mandatory training to make sure that we're as healthy in that space as we can possibly be. So I'm conscious of the length of the paper, but at the end of it, I do make a view and an offer to members that if they wish to see any of the training, I would be only too happy to show them, to explain it, to come and present further in more detail, because there, as you can see, there are quite a few number of different products that we deliver across the organisation. So I'm conscious there might be quite a few questions, so I'll pause there, Chair.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much. I think you've probably covered a lot of this as the meeting has played out. Members, any comments or questions on this? No, I think it would be helpful in some way. So if there's data there, so for me, it's that about how will you know? So I think some evidence about outcomes of the whatever mandatory and statutory. And I understand it then becomes difficult to know, what is a nice to do, and arguably there's not a huge amount of nice to do training. It's all really, really important in terms of looking after the workforce, looking after the members of the public. So I think if you could give some thought, Alan, please, in due time, maybe work with SPA officials to see what that would look like in terms of an overall dashboard for us. I think that would be helpful. Thank you. But very fulsome paper, really helpful, and good to see all the different layers. Any comments or questions from our staff colleagues? Brian?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think it's a direct correlation about the issue raised before, Chair, regarding training and OBL level for the operational position, because obviously Mr. Gibson and his team can only train the officers they can receive from divisions, and obviously divisions are slightly constricted with the OBL levels because they can't release officers for training if that takes them below operational base levels significantly. So there's a direct correlation between OBL and operational demand and training capacity and availability.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. So if we have no further comments or questions, Karen, can you remind me, have we covered off the action log? So we've got certainly the one we're keeping open in terms of the surefire. Was the other one the training?
Yes, the other one was the action against the
Mandatory
learning
statutory.
and, yeah.
So if we can bring that forward for maybe agree with Police Scotland's colleagues about when we'll see that. Alan?
Thanks, Chair. I think there's perhaps also an action sitting there in terms of the strategy document, and obviously the committee looking for an update. So if I could give you a short update on that. So in conversation with DCC Spears and executive colleagues, some of whom are online at the moment, DCC Spears asked me to pause the work on the strategy, and you'll see that learning and development is well documented within the previous papers that Director Miller mentioned in terms of both the strategic workforce plan and obviously the people plan. The DCC has asked me to look at a number of learning and development priorities rather than a strategic plan, and we're currently working through that, doing a piece of internal consultation before we then present it to the Strategic Learning and Development Governance Board. So once we have that firmed up, my plan and offer would be to come back to the committee to give you an update on that. But at this point in time, I've been asked to pause that work and look at 6 different priority areas, which includes prioritisation, governance, protected time for learning, identifying role requirements, and a number of other kind of key organisational kind of topics in terms of learning and development. So that's the update, Chair, if that's helpful.
No, that is very helpful. Thanks very much indeed for that. So according to my thinking, that's brought us to the end of the public meeting. We're going to have a short break, and people happy to come back at 12:30? Yeah, okay. Thank you all very much indeed.